Welcome to HIH2016, A History of Pennsylvania, Lecture 14 on Women and Gender in Pennsylvania History. And I offer you portraits here of a couple of particularly important women from Pennsylvania history. Tarbell, who passed away in 1944, and C. Dolores Tucker, who passed away in 2005. Now, it's always a sort of hotly debated question of whether or not we should have separate gender lectures in modules like this, or whether we should just make clear to students that women are a fundamental part of history throughout the course, of equal importance to men, and that we need not have a sort of separate lecture like this. And then maybe in the 1990s or 2000s, it was a standard practice to put in a separate lecture like this. Now historians are moving away from that a little bit, given the sense that they don't want to say only this is of particular note with respect to the history of women. Women are of acute importance, key importance throughout the history of the course and the period. So I want to both leave this lecture in place because I think special attention to highlight some of these issues is appropriate, but I want to also emphasize that throughout all topics covered in this course, the history of women and men throughout the existence of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is of course equally important. So don't come away thinking just one lecture on women. Think all lectures are on women as much as men, but this tops that up because I think that's still needed and justified. Okay, I give you an outline here of the content of this lecture to follow. It's in two parts. So part one, I want to offer you a case study of Ida Tarbell because she's kind of at the nexus of all things characterizing this period, the so-called Gilded Age before the Great Depression. And she both is a sort of a very strong-minded and educated woman, but she's at the forefront of the emergence of journalism. She has very personal contact with the oil industry, one of the key industries and monopolies in Pennsylvania history. She's part of the movement to sort of trust, bust, or break down unfair monopolies, which is important to Pennsylvania history and national history. And also she's at the forefront of progressivism. Don't be confused with what's being bandied about as progressivism in American politics today. Actual progressivism of the progressive era was something very, very different, as I hope to be able to convey here. Part two of this lecture will sample some key issues, particularly education, suffrage, and equality more broadly speaking, focusing in on the kind of a chronology of women's education in Pennsylvania, women's suffrage, and some more recent issues, particularly associated with not only gender equality, but equality for women of color. And I'll try and use the story of C. Dolores Tucker to convey some of that information. So let's start off with Ida Tarbell, because she's kind of the poster child for a lot of important issues in this period. She's born in 1857 in Hatch Hollow in Erie County, Pennsylvania. Keep in mind that Erie County is in northwest Pennsylvania. It's just at the edge of the so-called Allegheny Plateau. It's in that part of the Commonwealth, which is the last part to be opened up to farming, to be opened up to European settlers, and to be urbanized. She grows up in Titusville, Pennsylvania, which is right in the heart of the Allegheny Plateau, just off the west edge of the Appalachian Mountains. And it just so happens that Titusville would become the focus, really the birthplace of the world's commercial oil industry. In 1859, Edwin Drake kicks in, as the expression now goes, kicks in the first commercial oil well in the world, a so-called Drake's Well. There's now a large museum there with a good website. You can just Google Drake's Well Museum and find a wealth of information about the early history of the oil industry, Edwin Drake, and the town of Titusville as well. Now, eventually, he founds the so-called Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company. Well, actually, let me correct that there just a little bit. The Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company was actually founded by a lawyer from New York called George Bissell. Bissell hires Drake, who was actually had worked as a railroad conductor and had a free railway pass, to travel out to Titusville and see if there's oil there. Drake then found secures some land, and he knocks up his first oil well, and the Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company becomes the Seneca Oil Company with Drake as president. But the whole endeavor starts with just $200 and the Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company, of which Drake quickly becomes president after knocking in the first well. Now, this first well is only 70 feet deep. Oil happens to be very pushed up very near to the surface in Titusville. It's sort of in the foothills in the west edge of the Appalachian Mountains, where there's a lot of sort of pressure of layers of rock that help move oil towards the surface. This would become the world's first oil rush. In Titusville, there are perhaps 400 or so people living in 1860, but by 1870, there would be 9,000 persons living there. That's a remarkable movement of people into a small area. Titusville is quite a small place, squeezed between two very steep mountainsides, effectively, along waterway. In 1859, 2,000 U.S. barrels of oil are produced at Titusville. A bar is an abbreviation for barrel that you'll see in the slide there. By 1873, 10 million barrels of oil are being produced. And keep in mind that 10 million figure is annual domestic crude oil production across the United States, not just Titusville. Still, nonetheless, the discovery at Titusville is foundational for the widespread commercial drilling for crude oil that would spring up all over Pennsylvania and then other parts of America, in California and eventually in Texas. In January 1872, the world's first oil exchange is set up. This is a commodities exchange, a little bit like a stock market, but just for oil. And that commodities exchange is set up in Titusville, Pennsylvania. So Titusville, Pennsylvania, interestingly, in the long run, even as oil production would eventually wane in Pennsylvania, the presence of the exchange in Pennsylvania means that Titusville remains at the heart of the industry for many decades to come. Now, what's Ida's connection to this? Well, Ida Tarbell is a daughter of a man who becomes prosperous as an oil producer and refiner in Titusville. But he's driven out of the business by the so-called South Improvement Company, run by J.D. Rockefeller. Now, Rockefeller is one of these remarkable men in American history who manages to create a stranglehold over a number of industries. Oil is just one of them, and he becomes one of the richest men in America, one of the richest men in American history. Now, we'll come back to Rockefeller and his relationship with the oil industry in just a moment, but it's important to understand that Ida comes from a family who's right there at the beginning of the oil boom. Ida is sent off to college, as we call it in the U.S., but of course the when you say the word college in an American setting, that means what we think of as university in Britain. Now, Allegheny College in Meadville, Pennsylvania, which is just on French Creek, which is the north-south waterway which divided French territories from Pennsylvanian territories during the French and Indian War. Meadville's also just at the western edge of the Appalachian Plateau. It's the home of the oldest college, oldest continuously operating college west of the Appalachian Mountains in America. And Allegheny College is established in Meadville, Pennsylvania in 1815, and that's where Ida Tarbell's father sends her off to go to college, or university as we would say here in Britain. Now, Ida was among the first women admitted, and she was enrolled in biology at Allegheny College in 1876. And you'll see an image of the old college building at the top right of this screen. She was a wealthy young student from a family of prohibitionists and suffrage supporters. So this kind of places her in a particular kind of social context, that she's from that kind of strong Protestant family that is in favor of banning alcohol, something which would come about across America, of course, in the early 20th century, but also a family which values equality, including gender equality, supporting the right for women to vote. And it's not surprising that a family which supports suffrage for women also supports, of course, sending their daughter to attain an education. Now, she's a chapter co-founder of the sorority Kappa Alpha Theta, which is the first women's Greek sorority. We don't have a fraternity and sorority system here in British universities, but they're very important. It's a very important aspect of American university life and university life in some other countries. For example, in the Low Countries, fraternities and sororities are an important part of university life as well. They're effectively a kind of a club or a society where the students get together and in a more, how do I want to phrase this up here? They're a more encompassing club or society than we tend to have at a British university. So you will have to make a kind of personal oath or pledge to become part of that society. Most members of the society will live together in a building which is owned by the society in the vicinity of the university. And so it becomes not just a social circle, but they provide you with the place where you live. The fraternities and sororities for men and women, respectively. Frater in Latin, of course, means brother, and sororos means sister. So fraternities for men and sororities for women. They also provide, after you finish university, a kind of social network through which you find jobs, for example. And people remain members of fraternities and sororities for life, donating back to those societies long after graduation, and at certain events coming back to participate in the continued life of the fraternity or sorority. So what I'm getting around to here is it's a big deal in this period when the first women's sorority is created. Prior to that point, for only men had the opportunity of engaging in this kind of social network in the fraternity networks. The sororities are something new, and she's right there on the ground floor of that. She becomes a teacher, which in those days was one of the few occupations where a woman could work independently in a respectable manner. And she moves to Ohio for this. Ohio, keep in mind, is only 20 miles west of Meadville, where she goes to college. So it's not that big a move. And supposedly, she vowed not to marry as a suffragist. So you can see a sense of her ideological mindset here. From 1890 to 98, she goes off to Paris to study postgraduate history at the Sorbonne in the College de France. Now, the Sorbonne may not be a name you recognize, and it still exists, the university in Paris. But at this time, around the turn of the 20th century, the Sorbonne was the preeminent university in France, certainly for history. So think an equivalent of Oxford or Cambridge in an English context here. She becomes a journalist and correspondent of edgy, I think is probably the best word here, an edgy magazine called McClure's. Now, McClure's, they try and expose, they're at the forefront of a movement that would come to be called muckraking, where they try and expose scandals, usually political or financial scandals, to comment on the nature of the direction of society. This is something that we might take for granted now in journalism. Indeed, certainly in the last 20 years, journalism in the West has moved from reporting facts on the one hand and having editorial content on the other hand, to at present we pretty much have non-stop editorial content in which you have to fish for the facts. But the idea that you might take facts and endorse them with editorial content was quite revolutionary at the turn of the 20th century, and that's what the muckrakers did. They said, look, here's some facts you're probably not unaware of, and here's why they really matter, which was something of a departure. I suggest that you look at as a additional piece of reading. It's not required, but as an additional piece of reading, this article by Stinson here, Ida M. Tarbell and the Ambiguities of Feminism, in the Pennsylvania Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography 101 from 1977. That highlights different aspects of her personality as a suffragist and an early feminist, but also the way in which she backs away from that later in life, which is very interesting. Now, McClure's magazine, as I said, is at the forefront of this muckraking movement. Muckraking, the term muckraking implies an attempt to uncover immoral and corrupt activities in public life, and it relates to John Bunyan's famous book of the 17th century, The Pilgrim's Progress, in which there is a character who is a muckraker. Bunyan is from Bedford, of course, Bedford, England, and there is actually an entire kind of obscure Protestant sect that still exists, referred to as Bunyanites. At any rate, the term muckraking to refer to this kind of journalism has been attributed to Theodore Roosevelt. Of course, Roosevelt was the served as United States president, and it's attributed to him in 1906. But it's always questionable who first coined the phrase. Muckraking is very much aimed at the kind of middle-class voter. So the type of places where muckraking journalism appears, magazines like McClure's, are magazines that, in a time before radio and television, are there to allow middle-class people to see what's fashionable, to see what clothing will look like next year, what's happening in the world of art, kind of general information. So muckraking journalism doesn't get its start in newspapers, as we might expect, but rather in a slightly more specialized type of publication, aimed at a kind of literate voter. This kind of journalism is surprisingly welcoming of women, who, in a sense, women have a kind of stereotypical role in this Victorian period as the kind of moral compass of the family unit. And so the intersection between women receiving an education and the rise of muckraking journalism, which is meant to point the right moral direction or point out moral failures, they kind of work together effectively. So don't think of muckraking as something in which women go out there and throw off all their Victorian values, but rather something that's compatible with a fairly traditional, what we now call kind of Victorian view of femininity. Tarbell produces a 20-part series on Abraham Lincoln, which receives a double circulation. And this is where she starts, not necessarily doing the type of exposing of the bad side that we would see her doing later, but rather with a fairly traditional biographical work on Abraham Lincoln. In fact, for students interested in researching the history of Abraham Lincoln, how he's been perceived through time, this is a really important kind of benchmark, sort of 50 years on from the end of the Civil War, a bit less actually, to see how people were feeling about Lincoln. But it showcases her literary skills. Her famous work would be her History of the Standard Oil Company. Now, in 1882, the formation of the Standard Oil Company created a monopoly over Pennsylvania oil. And there's a very personal connection for her here insofar as it's the Standard Oil Company that runs her dad out of business back at Titusville. Peak production of oil in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania comes in 1891, so just a little earlier than Tarbell's working here, and just a little bit after the formation of the Standard Oil Company. So you can see the Standard Oil Company got in just before the peak of Pennsylvania oil production. And remarkably, in 1891, 58% of all oil produced in the United States is coming out of Pennsylvania, and mostly from that area around Titusville. So it's a remarkable volume of oil coming out of a small area, and it's a remarkably important industry for the history of the Commonwealth. But there are very few workers' rights. There's a lot of violence in oil drilling camps, in the towns around Titusville. It's very unstable. There are lots of these small companies that say buy a little bit of land, they kick in a well. To kick in a well is an expression that comes from the way in which wells were first drilled, which was to bend over a very tall but flexible tree to use as a kind of return spring from which you would hang a vertical log of wood that you would tie a rope to and then push down and bang against the ground with your foot. And then eventually you would bang the pointy end of this stick against the ground enough by kicking it down with your leg that you would drill a hole down into the soft earth in which oil might collect. Sorry for that little bit of digression there, but in case you're wondering what I meant by to kick in a well, it's literally to kind of kick downwards with your foot before well drilling was mechanized. So your average sort of person during an oil rush might get a little piece of land. He might hire a few people. That well might dry up pretty quickly. Then those workers are unemployed. They float around. They find somewhere else to work. There's anger over whether or not people are drilling wells too close to each other. It's a real a morass. These kind of early boomtown situations. Oil companies are totally unscrupulous. The fact that you have a lot of small drillers producing very near to each other and in competition with each other, it creates an opening. Given the lack of solidarity among oil producers, it creates an opening for bigger companies to come in, begin to buy up oil production, and to be really unscrupulous about it. Now, Ida Tarbell's serial publication, The History of the Standard Oil Company, is published between November 1902 and November 1904 in 19 parts. This is not unusual at the time. Keep in mind, for example, Dickens's novels being published in serial as a column in a newspaper. To produce big works in serial in periodical publications is quite normal for the time. Lincoln Steffens, who is another great muckraking journalist from Pennsylvania, makes Ida a staff writer. Makes her a staff writer for McClure's. Steffens himself is famous for having written a work called "The Shame of the Cities," Pittsburgh, a city ashamed, in which he exposed the Pittsburgh machine under McGee, and all of the kind of poor management and corruption that was happening in Pittsburgh, and how hard the sort of poor laborers' lives were there. And he really has made a name for himself as a muckraker in the first place. McClure having been at this point for a little while editor of McClure, Steffens having been for a little while at this point editor of McClure's magazine. Now, Steffens himself had started as a journalist in the New York Evening Post before taking on the job of editing McClure, and then he takes on Ida as a staff writing for McClure. In 1906, Ida co-founds a new radical magazine called The American Magazine. And this magazine managed to tough it out despite the new competition that would be thrown up by radio and eventually television. It manages to tough it out all the way to 1956, so a 50-year run. So Ida is influential not only in participating in, but also extending the reach of this kind of publication by founding her own magazine, of course. She's a really entrepreneurial person. If I focus a little bit more here on her history of the Standard Oil Company, it set about to uncover the realities of anti-competition monopolies, about horizontal integration, secret rates, and discrimination of cargo. Now, I've explained what a little bit of these things mean. Vertical integration is probably a term you're more familiar with. And so vertical integration is, say, for example, if you wanted to produce cookers, and cookers are made of metal, you might then buy a metal foundry and even a iron mine, so that you are in control vertically from the digging of metal out of the ground through the making of metal into sheets to actually building your cookers. But a little bit more insidious is horizontal integration. And horizontal integration is what J.D. Rockefeller and other monopoly makers specialize in this period. So in horizontal integration, one company buys other companies at the same level of production in the supply chain. So let me flesh this out a little bit for you. If you own a oil well, you might buy the railway company that brings your oil to market. You might also then buy a marketing company that sells that oil. So you're integrating the getting of the oil, the moving of the oil, and the selling of the oil. And that's quite different from vertical integration, where you're talking about buying the components to then make something at the top of that line of integration. No, you're not doing anything with the oil. You're just simultaneously being the one who gets it, who moves it, and who sells it. So this very easily leads to monopolies. What J.D. Rockefeller understands is that if he buys up all of the railway lines and takes control of them, then he can control who can get their oil out of the Titusville region in western Pennsylvania. When he does this, he can then set sort of secret rates. So he says to person A, if you'll ship at least this much oil, a large quantity of oil, I'll give you a real good rate on shipping it. If you're a small producer, I give you a really bad rate on shipping it by volume. This helps bigger producers become more profitable and drives the little producers out of business. But if you're standing there at the right time, when the little producer goes out of business, you can buy him up. So now you own the railway, plus you own the small producers. Once you have enough capital, you can go after the big producers. You can also create a sort of a discrimination of cargo. You could say, only haul small producers' cargo on a Monday. There are other forms of discrimination of cargo. But you can see the way in which you could manipulate the system. If you have a high degree of horizontal integration, say maybe you own the warehouses where the oil's stored, you own the railway that's the only way to get the oil out, and maybe you own the place where it's sort of barreled and distributed from at the other end, then you really can get a stranglehold on the whole system and run out of business, smaller competitors or people who you see as a threat to your own business. Now, the downside of this is for the consumer. I mean, there's downsides already for the small businessmen being run out of business. But for the consumer, once a monopoly is in place, or an effective monopoly where a big chunk of market share is controlled by one supplier, then the supplier can raise the price. As with any anti-competition situation or low competition situation, the suppliers pretty much can charge what they want because you're totally dependent upon them. Now, this inspires President Roosevelt to become the first trust buster. Ida Tarbell's work on the history of the Standard Oil Company is a big hit, as it were, within the circles of people who read those types of publications. It creates a certain degree of public outcry from the educated level of society who can understand what's wrong with this situation, and those at the bottom who have been hurt by being run out of business, like Tarbell's own father. Roosevelt picks up on this, and he becomes a trust buster. It's one of his kind of campaign pledges and one of the things he does in office. He, for example, takes the Standard Oil Company to court. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court in 1911. The question of whether or not they're an unfair monopoly can be broken up. And ultimately, the Standard Oil Company is broken up into 34 different smaller companies that handle different parts of the process of getting oil out of the ground and shipping it and storing it and marketing it. Some people have suggested that this didn't do a whole lot of good because the Rockefellers retained a share, obviously, in all of those 34 different companies that were created. I think anyone is right to be dubious of the effectiveness of breaking up companies when the smaller companies that are created still all belong to the same person. But of course, you can't expropriate companies or wealth. All you can do is force a big company to break into little companies. It still remains effectively the way it works today. And people have suggested that when investors looked at each of those 34 small companies and saw the profitability of each of them and bought in and invested in each of them, that the total net worth of Rockefeller may actually have gone up. So whilst a bit more competition may have been introduced, Tarbell's campaign against Rockefeller may actually have resulted in Rockefeller getting a little more wealthy. Ida has a big impact, though. A social impact and a legislative impact here as well. A whole series of acts come out of this era. There's the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, which bans monopolies, cartels, and trusts that are considered harmful to consumers. But it doesn't stop mergers of companies. And so companies continue to merge, and they're only ever broken up as monopolies when the government actively intervenes, which is a long road to follow, not always successful. Also, we see in this period the Eakins Act of 1903, which stops railroad rebates. Rebates had been a means by which companies charged differential rates for moving goods without breaking the rules. So this is something Standard Oil Company did, for example. Rather than just saying, you know, look, I'm going to charge a higher rate to that person over there because I see them as, you know, in a roundabout way in competition with me. Instead, what they do is they say, well, for everyone, there's the same rate, so I am abiding by the law, but I'll give a rebate to certain people under certain conditions, and then manipulate the system that way in favor of some users of the railway as opposed to others. So the Eakins Act of 1903 stops the rebate system. There's another antitrust act, the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. It finally bans mergers that create monopolies. So this is good because it prevents the monopolies from being created in the first place, because it's much harder retrospectively to sue companies of monopoly and break them up than it is to stop them merging. You'll probably hear about this today when you watch the news. Even here in Britain, there's a similar rule, and the government has to decide whether it's okay sometimes for mergers to take place, particularly with things like banks or utilities. The Antitrust Act of 1914 also leads to the Commission on Industrial Relations under Woodrow Wilson. And this looks at a whole range of industrial practices to try and stamp out the most unfair of them. Also, coming out of this period, in response to the kind of muckraking journalism and the big impact of things like Lincoln Steffens's Shame of the City's work on Pittsburgh, or Ida Tarbell's work on the history of the Standard Oil Company, something that comes out of this is President Roosevelt's square deal. These old campaign slogans. I mean, I don't know that campaign slogans and promises are much more complex today, but they're very straightforward by modern standards. At the end of the 19th, early 20th century, Roosevelt, he said we were going to have a square deal for all Americans based on the 3 C's. And his 3 C's were conservation of natural resources. He was a great one for setting up national parks, Roosevelt. The second C would be control of corporations. And the third C would be consumer protection. And consumer protection meant regulating drugs for their safety, and regulating food quality standards. This is when we get things like regulated prescriptions and requirements that drug companies provide goods that can be tested and approved for their purity and so forth. Things we take for granted today, really. So if we think a little bit about the world inhabited by Ida Tarbell, this is the era of progressivism. It's also the so-called Gilded Age. Both of these terms mean the same thing for our purposes, the progressive era or the Gilded Age. The phrase Gilded Age is a quote by Mark Twain, and it refers to the way in which this is a period of rapid industrialization in which vast fortunes were made and huge houses are knocked up around the peripheries of all the major cities. And it looks like America is amazingly wealthy. But that's just the kind of gold gilding, the gold gold leaf on the exterior. And if you scratch beneath it, you find that there are huge social problems and a lot of human suffering. And so it's a kind of satirical comment by Mark Twain to call it the Gilded Age, because what you see, the glitz and glamour on the outside is a kind of thin veneer of prosperity with a lot of human suffering underneath. Progressivism is the movement to try and improve the life of the working man. Keep in mind that progressivism is a policy championed by the Democratic Party, but of course, across this period, the Democrats are still pursuing a white supremacist platform, and so the Democrats when they try to improve conditions for the working man, mean the white working man. And from around about 1900, the Democrats add to that a layer of anti-immigrant hate. And so by the 1920s, think here about the sort of era of Woodrow Wilson that we alluded to in the immigration lecture, By the 1920s, the Democratic Party is working hard for the benefit of the working man, meaning the white non-immigrant working man. But the progressive movement poll is, it's a major national movement to try and improve conditions for ordinary people. And the Republican leadership of Pennsylvania, which is still a one-party machine state, is pulled along, and you get quite progressive Republicans. Keep in mind, there's a big difference between progressivism as it's meant in this context and progressivism as it's embodied by the current Democratic Party, which is about kind of racial politics and trying to make sure that every racial or gender group has equal results at the end of the day. So it's about equality of outcome rather than equality of opportunity, and it's much more about sort of race baiting, race politics than traditional progressivism of this era. So don't confuse the two. Also, because of the progressive politics of many Republicans of this era from Pennsylvania, you'll find that this is, whilst the phrase wasn't yet used, this is the era in which we see the beginnings of what are now called rhinos, Republican in name only Republicans from Pennsylvania. So this is kind of a facetious term meant to be insulting to Northern Republicans, but I don't see anything too troubling about. Well, I digress. The so-called Pittsburgh Survey of 1808-1809 is a concerted effort to survey working conditions in Pittsburgh, which is one of the most important industrial cities in America, and it's also the biggest steel producer in America. And because of its rapid and intense urbanization, it's seen lots of immigration, and it has a lot of poverty in shanty towns and so forth. So the Pittsburgh Survey tries to work out what are not just working conditions, but also living conditions like in and around Pittsburgh. It's an amazing document even now to look at parts of. I give you an image of the front of it in the top right of the slide here. But this era leads to a lot of regulation. It leads to housing regulation, the Pennsylvania Tenement House Act of 1895 and the Housing Act of 1903 to try and set some standards for what housing should be like. There's child labor regulation. So from 1893, from the Factory Act, workers have to be at least 13 years old and work no more than 12 hours a day and 60 hours a week. That sounds pretty extreme by modern standards, but it just gives you a sense that things must have been even worse if that was considered limiting the worst excesses of the system. I've listed a bunch of acts here that follow, but by 1935, you have to be 16 years old to work full time. You can work no more than an 8-hour day without special remuneration or a 44-hour week. In terms of education, Governor Wolfe signed the Act to establish general education in 1834, creating early free public school education in English. Keep in mind, German immigrants from the 18th century had German language schools. By 1900, Pennsylvania had 300 high schools with 27,000 students. But in terms of the percentage of possible students who are making their way into schools, that's still the worst degree of uniform education provided on the Atlantic seaboard. There are extraordinary increases in national and elite wealth. This is the kind of gold gilt that's referred to by Twain when he calls it the Gilded Age. And the kind of rapid increases in wealth at the top lead to overinvestment, poor investment. It's a bubble, as we'd call it today, which bursts on Black Tuesday, 29th of October 1929, when overall about 1/3 of all national wealth is lost when the stock market crashes, and this begins the so-called Great Depression. With respect to the Pittsburgh Survey, I've added a note at the bottom here, which is a nice quote from Klein and Hugenboom, taken from their volume, A History of Pennsylvania. With reference to the Pittsburgh Survey, they say, the surveyors found an utter neglect of human resources, since jobs could always be filled by new immigrants with low standards of living, willing to work for abnormally low wages. Unfortunately, we have the highest rate of immigration, largely illegal immigration, into America that we've had since the turn of the 20th century, happening right now. And we have exactly these same problems now, particularly in the South and West of America, where there are literally millions of illegal immigrants who have zero workers' protections in place. And of course, their presence, perhaps as many as 1 in every 300 Americans, means that it drives down wages for people at the bottom themselves, most notably. Well, we have another big change to resolve this. Well, the current use of the terms progressive, for progressive era, that suggests that modern democratic historians are trying to pick up with a new wave of progressivism, but the current version of progressivism seems to be much more about race baiting and differentiating different ethnic groups for different treatment in America than it does the kind of progressivism we had in the 1890s to 1920s. Education in the Gilded Age. Women begin to work less and receive more of an education more frequently. In 1908, women received about half the wages of men and worked 10 or 12-hour days, sometimes 7 days a week. It was because it was thought that, particularly if a woman's married, that her income was topping up the man's income, which should be sufficient to run the household anyway. So it's almost kind of a greedy double dipping for a wife to work. That's an unfortunate viewpoint. Women teachers receive less pay than men. Again, the same principle here, the idea that they have a husband who's providing a household income, and so really they're kind of taking a job that could support a different household and being a bit greedy. That's obviously wrong-headed. 1913 women's labor law was put in place saying that girls 14 plus could work only 54 hours a week, and that's succeeded by the 1935 law, as I mentioned before. And it said that girls should attend school to age 14. PA's oldest higher education institutions, I give them to you here in a list, and this is with reference to education institutions admitting women. Bryn Mawr University, given that name because it's on a big chunk of land granted by a Dolgellau, a gentleman, for the purpose of setting, and I mean Dolgellau in North Wales, for the purpose of setting up a university. It's a women's college from 1885, and it's Quaker. It's run by Quakers. The University of Pennsylvania is there from 1740, but only admits women in 1880. Moravian College there for 1742. Only admits women, it admits women from 1742, but they're separate. They're taught separately until 1954. You can read through the rest of this list at your leisure here, but it's fairly late, as you'll see. And there are some establishments of note here, particularly Clapham University is established as Pennsylvania's first all-female college in 1869. Well, not the first, but as established specifically as a all-female college in 1869. Suffrage is another hot-button issue of the day during Ida's lifetime, together with progressivism and education for women. In 1870, Pennsylvania ratifies the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The right of citizens of the United States the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This leads directly to the 1871 election, in which African Americans are allowed to vote in Pennsylvania for the first time since their vote had been stripped from them due to the Dred Scott decision back in the 1850s. And we'll have a whole lecture on this separately in a bit. On 10th of October 1871, riots happened in Philadelphia and 4 black men died, including Octavius Cato, who was one of the most famous of all early civil rights activists in Pennsylvania. Carrie Burnham is another key Pennsylvanian. She tries to vote as a woman, and she's denied the right to vote. From 1866, she had run a French school for young ladies in Philadelphia, and she's married to a lawyer, and she's applied to study law at the University of Pennsylvania, and she's denied the right to do so on the basis of her gender. She becomes a member of the International Working Men's Association in 1871, and she's out there fighting for the right of women to vote. She focuses her argument in favor of women being able to vote on the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1838, allowing freemen to vote, although that, of course, had at that time said freemen being white taxpayers. And she says that freemen ought to be interpreted in such a way so as to mean free persons. She sues when she's denied the right to vote, and in January 1871 she addresses the Pennsylvania Congressional Judiciary Committee, who 6 days later added the line male to the Constitution just to make clear that women couldn't vote. On 3 and 4 April 1873, she argues her case before the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, but she loses. Nevertheless, she is right there at the forefront of women's fight to vote, at the same time as the far more famous campaigner for women's suffrage, Susan B. Anthony. On January 1871, Susan B. Anthony and the National Women's Suffrage Convention had declared voting a woman's duty. And so I just want you to see that Burnham and Anthony are happening at the same time here. And really, as a Pennsylvanian, it always seems unfair that Susan B. Anthony is given this title as this sort of key supporter of women's fight for the right to vote, when in Pennsylvania we all know that it's actually Carrie Burnham who's the key figure in our history. In 1915, Pennsylvania holds a referendum on female suffrage. And I'll show you the results of that referendum on the first slide. Women did not win the right to vote in the 1915 referendum. And a lot of that has to do with cultural differences between different parts of Pennsylvania. On 18th of August 1920, the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution grants women the right to vote, and battling for that amendment to pass through the U.S. federal Constitution is associated with Susan B. Anthony, of course. Here's a picture of Carrie Burnham in the bottom right, and here are the results of the 1915 suffrage referendum in Pennsylvania. Counties in black are counties against women having the right to vote. And I want you to note here that this is the core of the old Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, filled up with Quakers. And in fact, that it's that kind of very conservative old religious Quaker elite, which is also the wealthier part of the country, wealthier part of the Commonwealth by this period, that are denying women the right to vote. The kind of rough and tumble west of the Appalachians, and the Appalachians run diagonally. You'll see my pointers here. The rough and tumble frontierish northwestern parts of Pennsylvania, from where Ida Tarbell grew up, for example, here in Warren County, they voted for women to have the vote. Well, at any rate, this would all become a moot point in 1920 when the U.S. federal Constitution is changed to give all women the right to vote, no matter what. Ida Tarbell's latter days are very interesting. Ida, at the end of her life, becomes an anti-feminist. From 1909, she begins writing articles and books telling women to embrace their female nature and to get married. She has a certain degree of regret. She begins to speak out against the suffragettes, and actually Ida Tarbell battles against women having the right to vote. She feels that the kind of progressive left edge has gone too far. And this is a quote from Stinson's article I cited on the bottom of an earlier slide. He says, "Surely the most tragic figure of all, thought Tarbell, was the militant feminist herself, the once attractive and now crippled woman whose nature has been destroyed by her very fighting publicly for equality. It's a very interesting take on it. Tarbell spends the last 30 years of her life, from the age 52 to the age of 86, as an anti-feminist, which is a longer part of her life than she was at the forefront of muckraking. So very interesting. We might consider in the seminar how much of a trailblazer she was, and if she betrayed the cause, as some have argued. Now I want to jump forward and give you another example of fighting for equality, but particularly equality for black women, because that's a separate wave of fighting for equality. And by this period, in the mid-20th century, the Democrats have actually done a 180-degree reverse. They've given up on white supremacy and anti-immigration, and by the mid-20th century, they begin working for the interests of people of color. Dolores Tucker is a key figure in the history of Pennsylvania, who becomes a key figure in the national history of the United States. She's a Philadelphia native with a Christian feminist mother. She's the 10th of 13 children of her mother and her father, a minister. She attends Temple University, which is established in 1884 and admits women in the very first year. And then she goes to University of Penn, which had admitted women since 1880. So these are schools with a long history of admitting women. University of Pennsylvania, UPenn, is in Philadelphia, of course. She studies in the School of Business at UPenn. She marches at Selma with Dr. Martin Luther King in 1965. And in 1971, she's appointed Secretary of the Commonwealth, the first black female to be so appointed. She institutes the Commission on the Status of Women in Pennsylvania. She appoints more women and black Pennsylvanians to boards and commissions and judgeships in the Commonwealth than had been appointed in the entire prior history of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So she's a transformative figure in Commonwealth history. She championed Pennsylvania's early ratification of the U.S. Equal Rights Act, banning any legal differentiation between men and women, which passes in Pennsylvania on the 27th of September 1971. But of course, that's an act which which failed to secure the backing of all states, and so never became an amendment to the United States Constitution, as was once hoped. She's very interested in divorce, employment, poverty law. These are the issues covered by the discrimination, by the Equal Rights Act. Divorcees ought to be treated equally. People ought to be treated equally in the realms of employment, property law, and so forth. I think the real problem was that the Equal Rights Act was so broad and vague in a lot of its legal definitions that not all states could get behind it, but most states did pass it. She reduced Pennsylvania's voting age from 21 to 18. So you can put her stamp on that fundamental change. Here's a picture of Dolores Tucker. But interestingly, like Ida Tarbell, she ceases to be at the edge of left-wing politics and actually becomes a conservative force late in life. She says, "No one and no industry will be allowed to continue this social and psychological genocide of the women of this nation." On her 1993 speech to the National Congress of Black Political Women. And what topic is she talking about there? The campaign against gangster rap or rap music. It's very interesting. In her later years, she leads the Democratic Black Caucus for 11 years, forming the party's women's wing. But she feels with the rise of sort of gangster rap or sort of hardcore R&B music that actually women are being poorly treated. And this is a claim that's just often made about R&B music even now, maybe the current R. Kelly affair can be set against some of his more caustic, anti-feminine lyrics, and probably make a good case in support of some of the things Dolores Tucker says. She, in 1995, goes so far as to picket music stores in Philadelphia. She's 68 by then. She buys shares in Time Warner Media and then demands at a shareholders meeting that they drop Tupac Shakur's label. If you're too young to know who Tupac is, have a look on YouTube and listen to some music. She called gangster rap pornographic filth, glorifying violence against women and misogynistic behavior. And I must say I kind of agree with her when it comes to the lyrics. They're absolutely, they're absolutely abhorrent sometimes in the way in which women are treated in the lyrics. She refers to the lyrics of this era of gangster rap as negative media which distorts male and female relationships. I give you a link here. You can, at the end of this slideshow, follow this link to, it's a link to an amazing, passionate speech that she gives, against the excesses of rap music. She uses the same rhetorical skills that Martin Luther King did. She's a fantastic speaker. She says that rappers, including Tupac, regularly cite. Rappers, including Tupac, regularly cite and ridicule her in songs. For example, I give you a quote here from Tupac criticizing Dolores Tucker from his song, How Do You Want It? She actually sues Tupac's estate for slander after his death in 1996. Remarkable woman. I can't possibly, in the course of an hour, and we're at an hour and 1 minute here, do justice to this topic. But if you're in the group of students on HIH2016B that have to select an essay topic, there's certainly a lot of material one could work with here. Thank you very much, and I'll catch you in the next lecture.